Welcome to the Businesstalk podcast. I am your host Deepak from India. Today we are honored to welcome Dr. Baruch Fischhoff, Heinz University Professor in the Department of Engineering and Public Policy and the Carnegie Mellon Institute for Strategy and Technology at Carnegie Mellon University as our distinguished guest on this episode. Dr. Baruch is a leading scholar of judgment, decision making, and risk, whose career bridges psychology, public policy, and science communication. A graduate of the Detroit Public Schools, he earned his BS in Mathematics and Psychology from Wayne State University and later completed a PhD in Psychology at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem under the mentorship of Dr. Amos Tversky and Dr. Daniel Kahneman. He is a member of both the National Academy of Sciences and the National Academy of Medicine, reflecting the breadth and impact of his contributions to science and policy. Over the course of his career, Professor Fischhoff has held leadership roles in several key professional bodies, including service as President of the Society for Judgment and Decision Making and the Society for Risk Analysis. He has advised numerous public agencies, chairing the FDA's Risk Communication Advisory Committee and serving on bodies such as Eugene Commission on the Rights of Women, the Department of Homeland Security Science and Technology Advisory Committee, and the EPA Scientific Advisory Board, where he led its Homeland Security Advisory Committee. His work has been recognized with many honors, including Carnegie Mellon's Ryan Award for Meritorious Teaching, the College of Engineering Outstanding Mentoring Award, the American Psychological Association's Award for Distinguished Contribution to Psychology, an honorary doctorate from Lund University, an Andrew Carnegie Fellowship, and the Sigma Chi William Proctor Prize for Scientific Achievement. Professor Fischhoff is a fellow of multiple scientific organizations, including American Psychological Association, the American Association for Advancement of Science, the Association for Psychological Science, the Society of Experimental Psychologists, and the Society for Risk Analysis. His influential books span both foundational theory and practical guidance, including titles such as Acceptable Risk, published by Cambridge University Press, Risk, a Very Short Introduction by Oxford University Press, Bounded Disciplines and Unbounded Problems, again by Oxford University Press, and Decisions by MIT Press, which together showcase his lifelong commitment to understanding how people make hard choices and how institutions can support better decision making. Today, Dr. Baruch Fischhoff joins us to share key insights from his influential work, decisions, studying and supporting people facing hard choices. It's my pleasure to now welcome Dr. Baruch Fischhoff to the conversation. Dr. Baruch, your presence is a distinct honor for us, and we are truly thankful for your time and wisdom.
Thank you for having me.
Professor, across the many domains you cover, like health, climate, national security, personal finance, you argue that hard decisions are often hard for different reasons. When you look back over the book, what do you now see as the core features that make a good decision genuinely hard for people?
Well, we would all rather not have uncertainty with our decisions. That is, we'd like to know what will happen and how we'll feel if things go right or things go wrong. But what often makes decisions difficult is complexity, where there are many things that we could do, many things that could happen, many kinds of information that we might like, and we don't know where to begin. That is, one might think of making investments for the first time, or moving to a new city and deciding where to live, or moving to a new city and deciding where am I going to find friends, or writing a will or a living will. People don't really know where to start, and it's the complexity that's really baffling. And there's often both complexity on the outside, we don't know what our options are and so on, and there's complexity on the inside. If it's a novel situation for us, we don't really know what part of us is at stake. How will it hurt how I feel about myself, how I feel about my relationship. So it's really that complexity that gives us a feeling that it's a hard decision.
Professor, a central theme of the book is that good decisions start with good problem framing, being clear on what options people have, what outcomes matter, and what they know or don't know. In practice, where do you see decision makers most often go wrong in this very first step?
So, perhaps continuing my previous comment, it's oversimplifying the complexity and not recognizing, what the challenges are. What you might think of it as we all live in some silo. We have a kind of bounded rationality within our silo. There's a set of problems decisions where by trial and error we've learned how to solve them. And then something new comes along and a hard decision comes along, and we don't know exactly what to do about it. And we can be stuck in our silo and not realize the complexity and not get help. We can also, in those situations, be pulled into somebody else's silo, that somebody wants to sell us something. Somebody wants us to become their acolyte. Somebody wants something from us. So it's important to have different perspectives. For those of us who are fortunate enough to live with people who have different perspectives in life. They may not be our perspectives, but we realize the diversity of opinions, diversity of kinds of expertise. That recognition that we need help, that we may be viewing things too narrowly, is a first step towards to getting the help that we need. I would say this is not just true of people, all of us in our everyday lives. It's also true of scientists. So you see, I don't know, psychologists who are interested in helping people to make medical decisions or decisions about the climate, not realizing their need to master the technical details. So with health, it's people's health decisions are culturally bound. They may have limited access to care. They may not trust the institutions. They may not have insurance. So giving them advice without really understanding that or understanding the quality of the treatment, or we're not doing our job right, or there are people in computer science who are very interested in the effects of AI on people's behavior. And I read a lot of studies by people who don't actually know like computer scientists who are brilliant in their own area, but don't actually know how to measure human behavior and don't realize the limits to their expertise. So when we don't realize our limits and we don't get the help we need, then we're stuck in our silos.
Professor, you distinguish between understanding what people know now, what they could realistically know, and what they only think they know in hindsight. How has your work on hindsight bias and uncertainty shaped the way you personally try to learn from past decisions?
So hindsight bias is close to my heart. I did my doctoral dissertation many years ago on hindsight bias, and it is the feeling an exaggerated sense of believing that we knew what would happen once we saw what actually happened. And like many imperfections in our decision making, it reflects a natural, generally adaptive way of making decisions. You see something happen, you see the outcome of a cricket match or the way a stock has behaved, how somebody fared in an election, and we try to learn from it. It's natural to try to learn from experience and process that information. But so that's good. That's adaptive. There would be maladaptive not to try to learn from what we observe. But once that happens, we have in effect rewired our knowledge, our memories. So it's very difficult to retrieve how we saw things before we had that additional information. And if we don't think about hindsight bias, then we fall right into a trap. Even if we do think about hindsight bias, it's hard for us to reconstruct where things were. So you can protect yourself against it in your own life if you take notes before you make a decision, or before an election. You say this, or a sporting match. You think this is what I think is going to happen, or before you go into surgery, that you create a record, which is in effect what historians do. They look for original sources, people's diaries. They recognize that the diaries, historians recognize that the diaries that they found are not accurate representations of reality. Even when people try to be honest with their diary, they're see what they write is seen through the filter of their everyday life. But you do have that record, and if you have, I guess it's a form of humility to recognize that you weren't as smart before you learned things, and then try to figure out where you were. Then you can be fairer to yourself, fairer to other people, and have a better understanding of the limits to your own knowledge. I mean, if nothing surprises you, then you think you have, when it should, then you feel then you're exaggerating how much you know. There's a compounding bias, which is called outcome bias, which is the tendency to judge decisions by their outcome rather than by the process that led to them. So, from a decision theory perspective, um, if you gave a decision your best shot, you consulted with people, you reflected until you were no longer making any progress, then we should live with whatever happens. Sometimes it'll be better than we deserve. Sometimes it'll be worse than we deserve. But if we gave it our best shot, we did the best we could, it didn't turn out, then we shouldn't add the insult of regret to the injury that's already occurred to us.
Professor, one of the
You'll
yeah,
find this. I mean, what an interesting place where you find this in law is so many cases in accidents, suits over accidents, um, uh, are all done in hindsight. Somebody was injured in an auto accident. The driver is sued. I've had some interaction with a law firm in Chicago who represents defendants, and their expertise is in reconstructing what accident scenes looked like as they were happening. So they say, here's where the trees were, here's where the parking was, and so on, in order to, give an honest appraisal of what was, what the driver could see. Um, uh, I would say, in addition to hindsight bias, sometimes one had a duty to know things that one didn't. So if you didn't see something because you were driving too fast, your problem is driving too fast. Your problem is not being judged in hindsight.
Professor, one of the striking threads in the book is your insist that ordinary people's mental models of risk often have their own logic and structure, rather than being simply irrational. Can you share an example where listening carefully to lay people's thinking fundamentally change how experts approach a policy problem?
So a famous study historically, one that influenced our thinking, was by Howard and Elaine Leventhal, who are a psychologist and a gerontologist, who were trying to understand why people ignored signs of why high blood pressure was undertreated or hypertension was undertreated. They found when they talked to people that people, given the name, expected to feel hyper or tense. And they had a very successful campaign many years ago describing hypertension as a silent killer. And then explaining to people how it worked. In one of our first mental model studies, we worked with the Environmental Protection Agency, which had discovered that there were places in our country, probably in your country too, where the bedrock produced there were radioactive rocks in the bedrock that decomposed as radon. And if radon gets trapped in people's houses, then it decays very quickly, releases a lot of energy. Particularly if you're a smoker, then it latches onto the smoke particles, get clogs in your lungs. So a little bit of radon goes a long way because of the short half-lives of the radon progeny. And and EPA had a major program on radon, and it wasn't getting anywhere. And we started to talk to people. This is one of the areas where you have it. It turns out that people knew that radiation was, um, they knew about radioactive contamination. They knew that they had heard about the long half-lives of other radioactive materials that meant that they were there forever. There was nothing that you could do about them, and it was hard to imagine that a colorless, odorless gas could really be a problem. And what we found, and then EPA then implemented a program that if you gave the explanation I did just a second ago, that it just keeps coming from the rock below you, a little bit of radon goes a long way, and if you're smoke, then the particulate matter will give you problems. So people interpret things about the world based on what they know, all their existing mental models. And here people had an accurate mental model for other kinds of radioactive materials, but not for radon. So we could supplement their models, and they understood it better. Another example, there's some colleagues of ours at Climate Central, that's near Princeton, have a are concerned among are concerned with getting factual, unspun information about climate change to people. And one of the things that they've done is they found that people in coastal areas in the United States don't realize the risk from storm surge. And one of the things that they did was to create active models of how inland areas can be subject to storm surges because water finds its ways in ways that if you didn't know the detailed topography and soil soil chemistry, you wouldn't know. So their people had the right model, but they didn't know what were the pieces that they could use. So, if in some ways we respect people. They know a lot. That's all we can do, and somebody needs to help us.
Professor, you have done longitudinal work on decision-making competence, especially with adolescents and young adults. What have you learned about how decision skills develop over the life course, and what the implies for how families, schools, and workplaces should support those skills?
So my good friend Maya Bar Hillel, who was the TA in my first course in graduate school, Amos Tversky's Introduction to Mathematical Psychology, commented a few years ago about developmental psychology that she said for those who study infants, the better their observations, the smarter infants become, or the smarter the infants look, that if you know how to look, then you discover that infants have notions of numeracy, have a theory of mind, have senses of empathy that you wouldn't know if you didn't have those observational techniques. So those of us who have, those are fortunate enough to be parents that's what we try to do. We try to look carefully and see what's doing, but some things are just not intuitive. So our contribution to developmental psychology has been with adolescents. And what we have found is that adolescents, as we've looked at them, are more competent as decision makers than they're often given credit for. And so, what do we bring that's novel here? Well, those of us in decision science, as the field is called, we always begin our studies by trying to describe what is the decision that people are facing. And so realistically, what are the options that say adolescents are looking at? What are the things that they care about? What are the things that they have been told and have maybe not been told, maybe have been hidden from them? So you can characterize their decision, and then you say, well, where are they with respect to that decision? What do they know? What do they don't know? How well do they understand themselves at time in their lives that we all went through when you're trying to find out what's really important to you, where experimentation is important to you, and where you sort of count on the adults in your life to provide a safety net when your experiments go poorly. And so what we've found is that by age 15 or 16, most adolescents have the cognitive decision-making abilities of adults, which is true about most areas of higher order cognition. We find that they know more about some things than their parents. For those who have kids, those who are learning about computers from their kids will attest to that. And they know less about some things. Sometimes they're not told. Sometimes, things about risks, things about sexuality in some cultures. So they have gaps in their knowledge. And so when they sometimes make mistakes they do make decisions they would rather that they didn't make. But it's not because they're stupid. It's not because they can't think. It's because they don't have the information about the world or about themselves. There are things that are different about the world in which adolescents make decisions. For those who study it, there's some sense that adolescents have less emotional regulation than older people. Not that adults are perfect in their emotional regulation, and that they are often in socially coercive situations. Think back to nightmarish high school situations in which the pressures of those situations sometimes get kids to act against their better judgment. And some of the most effective programs in helping kids to get through that learning period intact are ones that help them to get out of socially coercive situations, which you often need to do upstream, that you need to find graceful ways of saying, you've been drinking, I'm not driving with you. They're passing a joint around, and how do you get out of that situation with yourself self intact? So we find that in some ways kids are not all that different from us, at heart and in the mind, but they live in a different world, giving them good and trustworthy information and trusting them to make their own decisions. If kids, well, like anybody, if you think that somebody is spinning the facts, then why would you trust their version of the facts? So something else we've done is that. So how have we decided that adolescents are like adults? Well, we give adolescents the same experimental tasks that we give adults, and we find that they perform similarly. And a perfectly reasonable question would be, well, how do you know the tasks that you give people in your studies have any relationship to the decisions that people make in their lives? So we've had a very unusual collaboration with a project at the University of Pittsburgh led by Ralph Tarter, who's a developmental psychologist focused on substance and alcohol abuse, in which Ralph has followed a large cohort of young people from ages 10 to 30. Somebody, if psychologists get medals for science, keeping a project together for 25 years, deserves a medal of valor. And so with Ralph's help, we have given young people a battery of our tests, our psychological tests, looking at different decision-making skills. We found at age 18 and 19 that those skills hung together. There's some people just did better on our tasks than others. We found that people who have more decision-making competence, they tend to do score better on intelligence tests, whatever those measure. But it's different. It's not entirely correlated. We find that young people who have higher decision-making competence scores are more likely to come from homes that where good decision-making was modeled and rewarded, from intact homes, holding other things constant. We find that using the data in Ralph's database, we found that kids or young people who have higher decision-making competence scores also get into less trouble. They report drinking less. They're less likely to have multiple sexual partners early in life. They're less likely to have psychological diagnoses like oppositional defiance disorder. And so there seems to be some ecological or external validity in our test that correlates with precursors and consequence of what you'd expect to have good decision making. And thanks to Ralph's effort, we were able to give the same test to the people who were 18 and 19 when they were 30 and were mustered out of the study, and found a high correlation between their scores from the sort of late adolescent to sort of beginning of adulthood. So we think that there's something there.
Professor, the book repeatedly returns to the ethics of decision support, where the line lies between empowering people and nudging or manipulating them. When you design a decision aid today, what ethical questions do you insist on asking before you are comfortable deploying it?
Yeah. Thank you for asking the question. Thank you for posing it that way. So, my personal ethic, and this is what's important to me, and other people will have, could well have others, is I think the goals of our projects are to enable people to make autonomous, independent decisions to the extent that's possible, while recognizing that there are limits to that. If you ask people to make decisions where they don't have the right information, or they don't have the time, or they're under the kind of pressure that keeps them from thinking straight, then leaving them to make their own decisions is actually abandoning them to other pressures. So I tend to be this. So this is our point of departure. What decision are people trying to make? Where are they now? Can we help them to a better state? In doing that, we need to, some sense, fight what's a common, I guess, meme in our field of looking at the psychology of decision making and emphasizing the negative in thinking about people's decision making. One of the organizing frameworks for our field is that people make decisions using generally valid heuristics, which is all any of us can do in situations we don't know the right answer, and those heuristics sometimes lead to biases. We understand it in the nature of our science. We understand the biases, but understand the heuristics by looking at the pattern of biases that they produce. It's a bit like pathology in medicine. Our physiology is very complicated. If you have if you have a particular pattern of troublesome markers in your blood, then somebody can work back and say, well, where did this come from? It's my sense that there's a tendency for people who work in the field, and particularly people who have offer popular accounts, of the field, bestsellers, for the trade book market, to emphasize the negative, to talk about things that are bad. It's a good story. It's just that it's a good story. To some extent, it's a true story, but it's an incomplete story. So, and if you put too much faith in the bias story, then you end up giving up on people too early. You end up saying, oh, well, they couldn't make these decisions. I guess we have to manipulate them or restrict them by rules or nudge them in ways that they can't see. But if they knew about our nudges, they were if they just knew if they knew how we were manipulating their choice architecture, then they would be glad that we did it. So I try to see how far we can push the envelope of of competence. And it typically requires a team. As psychologists, we know some things. If we work with sociologists or anthropologists, they know things about the constraints. Certainly, people who know about decisions, about the particular decision domain know things. I was thinking, two of my former PhD students, Tamar Krishnamurti and Alex Davis, with some help from me and from some maternal fetal medicine people, developed a terrific app for pregnant women. So called My Healthy Pregnancy, that for a while the University of Pittsburgh Medical Center was using routinely. I'm not actually sure if they're still using it. And so it had a good interface design, not our expertise, but that it asked people when they logged on how they felt. It turns out that people like to be asked how they feel, even if it's by a computer. It had it provided, people with pregnant women with mental model with information that corresponded to their mental models, developed with a lot of testing with women, particularly in poor neighborhoods in Pittsburgh. And it had a statistical module, which or under subtext, which once there was a baseline of people's of self-reports of how they felt, to look for a precipitous break in their feeling. And from the medical literature, which our colleagues knew, that a break in people's feeling is often associated with depression, which can happen in pregnancy, or intimate partner violence, which can also happen in pregnancy. So they found an ethical way of communicating this signal with the primary caregivers so that they would find a way of pursuing pursuing this. So you can imagine the ethics are very, very complicated, but this was the kind of situation where you need to look broadly at people's decisions. So we know about the cognition, but other people know about the emotions and the social constraints.
Professor, in chapters on health and environmental risks, you emphasize that numbers alone are not enough. How information is framed and explained matters greatly. If you had to give one or two concrete rules of thumb for communicating quantitative risk responsibly, what would they be?
My rule of thumb is talk to people. And without talking to them, you don't know what problem they're solving. You don't know what they believe and don't believe. You don't know who they trust. Don't know what resources they have. You don't know how they've been treated in the past, and you have no idea how they look at you. You look at you or interpret their messages. So it's actually real remarkably simple. If we are developing a communication, say, as that part of a research project, we do think aloud protocols. You ask people to say, "Hey, we've got a draft. Read this aloud. Tell me everything that comes into your mind as you see it. You're helping out. We're not testing you. If it's confusing, you tell us whatever comes into your mind." And inevitably, however long you've been in the communication business, you find that things that look clear to you were confusing to other people. Things that were clear to them were being interpreted in a different way than you intended. Things that you thought went without saying were missing. Things about your tone that you thought were supportive were actually offensive. Things you were telling them they already knew and felt like you were talking down to them by telling them the obvious. So, if you anybody can do this. If you know, I mean, it's what we do in our everyday lives, that we talk to people. If we can establish rapport, we can figure out how to communicate with them. What's unfortunately not often, it's often not the case that people who create communications for larger audiences, for broadband communication, they're out of touch with their audience. And the research shows that people, we all exaggerate how well we communicate. We think we're clearer than we are other people. We exaggerate how well people understand that. That's part of the human condition. So But the research shows that the farther you are from your audience, the greater that exaggeration. So when technical people talk to lay people, when professional community, so you're if you have some technical information to communicate, you're not the right person to do it unless you talk to people. So you have professors who uh, write terrible science communications, but are great in the classroom because in the classroom, I mean, sometimes you're talking at your students, but you can tell when they're not paying attention. You can tell when they're not getting answers right on question, getting their answers right on the test, and you dictate the curriculum. That is, in the classroom, I decide what's on the test, what they need to read. Whereas in a risk or a health communication, uh, it's people's need determine the curriculum. So if you don't talk to them, you may talk clearly about things that don't interest them, or talk unclearly about things that do interest them. So I think there's a virtuous process of talking to people. You'll be educated as well as they are. So there are our field has a kind of a particular kind of discipline listening where in the first stages we try to understand what people's goals are, how they view their options, what are the things that are on their mind, and so on. Implicitly, we're building a decision tree for people. We wouldn't typically you wouldn't show people a decision tree because it looks too mathy and too formal, and it's not intuitive. But that's our kind of structured empathy in our field. So that's our secret sauce in talking to people. But if people would. There's so many communications you see them, you're on the bus and doctor's offices that you think nobody thought, what were they thinking? Nope, they did no testing at all. So, yeah. So there's my rule of thumb: talk to people.
Professor, you describe several ambitious collaborations with agencies such as the FDA, Environmental Protection Agency, and national security institutions. Looking back, what conditions had to be in place for science to genuinely influence those high-stake decisions rather than being used by symbolically or ignored?
So I think there are conditions both internal and externally. So within an agency, it's very important that it have what some economists call absorptive capacity, that there needs to be somebody inside who can use the science that you would like to provide and knows where to go to get the science. There's always people willing to sell their services to anybody who can write a check, and you need to figure out who is the right person for your need. And if it's in and unless there's somebody on the inside who can make that call, then you're going to get the wrong advice, and you're not going to be able to see it through. And on the outside, the scientists, experts who think that they have something to say need to have sustained relationships with people inside the agency. That you need to know their reality. You need to understand their constraints. They need to have the kind of interpersonal relationships that we appropriately need for trust, and they have to have a feeling that you will be there with them for the long run, that you will be, if things go badly, you'll be there. You're not just working this project. So one of our best the projects I'm most proud of is that the Food and Drug Administration developed a benefit risk framework. It took them 10 years to do it. They had a couple of our former graduates, Teresa Mullen and Sarah Eggers, who did it, and they now have a very nice tabular summary of how they how they decide what is the evidence that they find decisive in deciding whether to approve drugs, pharmaceuticals, or biologics, that's vaccines and blood products. It took a couple of years working with staff. They needed to work it into their workflow, so this wasn't additional work. They needed to test it. They needed to reward people to do it, and it was approved a couple of years ago, and it'll probably be in the paperwork for a generation. but that's what you do. And then I can't talk too much about this, but I've had the opportunity to be a mentor to some military fellows here, like lieutenant colonel level, and one of them took the FDA's benefit risk framework and implemented it in one of our intelligence agencies. And as somebody from the inside, she knew that she needed to have a team that would work with the people she expected to adopt it and adapt it in terms of that. And she needed another team that would work it into their personnel policy. How would you train people, recruit people, and reward people? So we need people on the inside and on the outside.
Professor, the book ends by reflecting on the institutional conditions needed for decision science itself to thrive: funding models, disciplinary silos, incentives. If a university president or foundation head is listening to this conversation, what are the most important structural changes you would urge them to consider?
I would say, please call me if you're out there. So as you mentioned, I wrote another book called Bounded Disciplines and Unbounded Problems for Oxford University Press that came out earlier this year, which goes into this in great detail. And its premise is that we need people with deep disciplinary science. As I was saying before, you need people who know psychology. If you're going to study behavior, you need people who know artificial intelligence or climate science if you're going to work on those things. And so you need people who, with disciplinary training, and you need to create positions in which they are rewarded for continuing to publish in their discipline, so they stay fresh, and there are people who so that they stay fresh and they perhaps can change their discipline and are capable of working on and are rewarded for working on multidisciplinary problems where people come together. So my intellectual home for many years has been our Department of Engineering and Public Policy, where almost all of our faculty have joint appointments. So they're expected to continue to publish in their home discipline, and then to represent that discipline on joint project on energy, privacy, climate, whatever the things are. And it's representing the disciplines that sometimes my particular chapters in decision-making research are not the relevant one, but I do know there's research on emotion. We can find that. We can find that. So it's actually pretty rare to find, stable careers for people who will do both. And you end up with applied people who don't take advantage, applied projects that don't take advantage of disciplinary science, and disciplinary sciences that end up in their silos with work that they hope somebody will make use of. So I think we need them both.
Dr. Baruch, I would like to conclude this episode with one last question. You write that one hope for the book is to help readers be kinder to themselves when hard decisions don't work out. For listeners facing a personally difficult decisions right now, what practical steps from your research would suggest they take so that whatever the outcomes they can feel, they decided well?
So I mean, pulling together some things that we've talked about. So one is get out of your silo, talk to other people, find out the kind of expertise. Hope that you can find people and sources that are trying to help you, not trying to pull you into their silo. Recognize how difficult the decisions are. So sometimes even the best decisions will go badly. I would say, don't listen to purveyors of the bias meme. If you hear people say that, experts saying the public are terrible decision makers and innumerate, the evidence really doesn't support that. We wouldn't get as far as we have in our lives. Those of us who've been, fortunate to make it and had circumstances that allowed us to make it, if we weren't fairly good decision makers. Protect yourself from outcome bias, so that sometimes bad decisions go awry. Protect yourself from hindsight bias. Recognize what you knew and didn't know. Try to learn from experience. I'm an optimist on people's ability to make good decisions if we support them and if they have a society that's kind to them.
Thank you, Dr. Baruch Fischhoff, for joining us and walking us through a lifetime of work on how people confront their hardest choices. Your reflection on decision making, spanning personal health, public safety, climate, and national security offer a powerful reminder that good decisions are not about perfection, but about clarity, humility, and care for the people affected. Your stories from decisions show how rigorous science, when combined with deep listening, can genuinely help individuals, institutions, and policymakers navigate uncertainty more wisely. As our world faces even more complex risks, the tools and mindset you have developed about framing problems, engaging with values, and communicating honestly about uncertainty feel more essential than ever. On behalf of our listeners, thank you once again for sharing your insights and for your decades of work in building a science of better decisions. We encourage everyone tuning in to explore your book Decisions, studying and supporting people facing hard choices, and to reflect on how these ideas might inform the difficult choices in their own professional and personal lives. Thank you once again, Dr. Baruch Fischhoff, for this enriching conversation.
Thank you for having me. And for the listeners, I should note the book is available open access. You can download it for free in 3 different formats. So I hope people will enjoy it.
Yeah, thank you.